Several months have passed since I completed Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, and even more have passed since the game actually came out. I think, admittedly, recent events have made keeping track of time much more difficult than usual, and I'd considered doing the review in several different ways. I'd even planned to have various sketches implemented into it as well, but that's just not how it turned out. As the months rolled on, it became harder to write the script for it and come up with ideas that I thought would fit. And finally, I think I just decided that at 3 a.m. in the morning, I was going to do the voice recording for it and do the actual review. And so this is what this is. Because if I'm not going to do it now, I'm never going to do it. So maybe in the future I can get different videos done in a more professional manner. But this is just the form that this review is going to take. Because I put 100 plus hours into the game to complete it. And I'm not going to let that time go to waste on not doing the review in the way that I wanted to do it. The story for Dragon Ball Z Kakarot is the easiest part to talk about. I mean, have you ever seen Dragon Ball Z in the past or known anybody who has? Well then congratulations, because you already know the story for this game. It follows most of the anime pretty well, with the exception of some added content in the form of side quests, or just general little things that they added into it. But there are some really obvious cuts and downplays to the story that I think takes away from the whole experience. I won't pretend that Dragon Ball Z is sacred and everything is important to it, but there is some very important pacing to certain events and some scenes that have such an intense build-up that with them gone, it takes away from the scene as a whole. I won't go too deep into the cuts because I've written that script before and it was really fucking long, but it feels like for any point I give it in genuinely funny side quests or good adaptations, I have to immediately take away with some of the presentation, cutbacks, or line delivery. They got many voices from the anime to return, or at least ones that sound similar to the ones from the anime, but some of the line delivery just feels a bit phoned in for the game and just generally deadpan. I would also like to preemptively say no to anybody thinking of mentioning using the Japanese voiceover for the game. I have nothing against their work, but I much prefer the English voiceover. I've tried Dragon Ball Z with the Japanese voiceover in the past, and it just doesn't feel the same to me. Maybe someday I'll give it another shot, but today is not that day. So the story ticked me off in places, but we all know gameplay is another key factor in video games. So how does the gameplay in Dragon Ball Z Kakarot hold up? Well, it is kinda boring. I'm sure they tried as hard as they could to make it interesting, and to be fair, it is far better than Dragon Ball Z Saga's ever was. But it basically boils down to punch, super attack, repeat for every battle in the game. Which, admittedly, is the combo for most Dragon Ball Z games in general, but it has far less variety and is very easy to find one really broken attack that just ends the fight. Kinda like in regular Dragon Ball Z now that I think about it. For a lot of fights, I would just spam attacks like Vegeta's Big Bang attack over and over and win the fight without ever getting hit. But even when I did get hit, health items are so easy to find and buy that I could just constantly feed myself with them in the heat of battle and never die. There is some side business about fishing and collecting materials so you can cook food which increase your stats, and I did do a lot of that. But the bonuses really only come into play from the home-cooked meals that Chi-Chi makes. You can also collect medals to upgrade a car for the 2 driving minigames, and while it is a funny addition to the game, it doesn't add much to it as a whole, except that it's there. There's also a baseball minigame, but much like the driving one, it just feels like it's there for the sake of the joke. Because, the anime had a baseball, well, not a baseball episode, but it had baseball in it, and, it had the whole car episode from the anime. So it's there because of those, but in the game itself, they don't have much impact at all except to give you money or some basic items that really aren't that good. So it feels like it's there for the sake of habit. The music for the game is actually pretty good, though admittedly I am not a musical expert, nor do I have any experience with the music itself, so just take my opinion with a grain of salt. I think a lot of the tracks sound varied, and some I really enjoyed because they played well into the scene that they were in, and you can even listen to them in a special menu, which I always think is a pretty nice inclusion. The game also gives you brief character bios and information about the world, kind of like Kingdom Hearts 2 does. At least that's what comes to mind whenever I look at that interface. But the information is really general and doesn't describe much, and if you're a fan of the series, I doubt it'll tell you anything new. There are some side missions that try to add lore to the series and to explain some questions from the anime, but I think that the answers it gives are kind of stupid in the nicest way possible. I think it takes away from some of the mystery that some of those questions had. Much like some of the retcons from Dragon Ball Super, I just choose to ignore it as much as possible. I will say that the game also looks fairly nice. I think it has a really good style, minus some graphical glitches I found and some odd looking character models. It really does resemble what I feel the show might look like in a more 3D environment. Now that doesn't mean I would watch an episode of the show that looked like this, because I'm still having Shaolin Showdown flashbacks. But I think it services for the game rather well. And I'll just say hell, like some of the pre-rendered cutscenes, they look really good. It's just a shame they have to be like overshadowed by a lot of the regular cutscenes that are made in-engine and look really choppy and boring. So I guess that's all I have to really say about it. In terms of Dragon Ball Z games, it really isn't the worst. Trust me, there are far worse ones than this. But it lacks the depth that a lot of people expected it to have. Personally, I would have preferred a Legacy of Goku remake, or just fewer story arcs in the game with DLC to fill the gaps later on. With trying to encompass all of Dragon Ball Z, it spreads itself thin, and while it shows glimpses of the potential it could have had, ultimately it just becomes a rather standard licensed anime game, which is kind of fitting given the studio that is behind it also made the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm games, which I can only say are just kind of that, the standard licensed anime game. But I mean, I applaud the attempt they made, and I can enjoy aspects of the game, and it's not an entirely unenjoyable experience. I mean, I really had a sense of joy and fun while I roamed around the overworld listening to podcasts. It took me back to the days of playing Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi while also looking around the maps. And instead this time there's actual things to look at because there really wasn't anything in Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi. And I do hope we get another game like this, or at the very least, I hope it opens the gateway to a more experimental Dragon Ball Z game in the future, because on the whole, this is the more safe bet. It doesn't alienate anybody with odd ideas or weird gameplay like Super Dragon Ball Heroes or Dragon Ball Fusions might, and it is incredibly easy to pick up if you haven't seen the show in years. Truly, I consider it the plain white bread of Dragon Ball Z games. It's sustaining, but it's ultimately bland, and it's usually better toasted and with some butter. And now that I've poured 100 hours in, I can be completely done with it because, I mean, there's not extra content that requires you to be at max level to fight, say, a God of Destruction. And that's totally not out, is it, by the time that I make this video? And I'd like to personally thank @SelenaEagle_ on Twitter. She's the one I commissioned to make the profile picture, which I also used in the thumbnail for this video. You'll find a link in the description to her Twitter page. Check out her work because it's really nice, and she turned a really crappy image, which I'll probably put up on the screen if I still have it, into what you see now, which is glorious, and I love it. And also a special thank you to Rifty Beats, who made the background music for this, not specifically for this, but he has a lot of great remixes that he'll allow pretty much anybody to use for background or other purposes, as long as you give him credit, which he deserves because it's honestly great. And I guess that's where I end this video and try to figure out what the fuck I will talk about next. And I'm sure many of you are thinking, hopefully nothing.